Next on the agenda, we have Erik Fisher, who will be talking about a pet interest of his, and I won't steal his thunder. Over to you.
Thanks, Kat. Let's see, I've got some slides, so I'll try to share my screen. And maybe I can make them large. So I agree with what Kat just said about Jumana's talk. Thank you very much. Very inspiring, very crisp, forward-looking. On some level, I think my rather more formal and scholarly work that's about to come at you is just trying to build a foundation to support the things you're doing already. So I welcome yours and everyone's comments and critiques, because this is really just something that I think is the beginning in terms of building a framework. I've titled this short talk, Principles of Public Interest Technology, Learning from Responsible Innovation. As Dave mentioned, responsible innovation is one of the cognate areas for PIT, and it's one that has probably received the most attention, policy, scaffolding and infrastructure, as well as conceptual development. And even though I won't go into it specifically, a lot of what I've got is drawing from that. So I wanted to just start off with two statements. I'm not going to read them all. You can just look at the highlighted text. These are just, two statements about public interest technology, and I think they get at two sides of the same coin. One is to develop better outcomes through technology for the public, and to deliver those. The other one, though, is what I call rationale two, and that is attending to the failures and looking at all the ways in which technologists and technology have risked undermining the public's trust and the very ties that bind us together. And so that sort of gets into this idea of unintended consequences. So, just to kind of start off and frame things, I think we can say that public interest technology consists both of technology, but also of what, I love this phrase, civic-minded technologists who design, develop, disseminate, and regulate that technology. And I think it's important to say that we want to build, not just at ASU, but I think throughout the entire PIT network, a broad understanding of who is a civic-minded technologist. It doesn't necessarily have to be people who have engineering degrees. Okay, we can have liberal artists and humanists and social scientists that also fit this, this role. But we basically, I'm going to present three rationales and then sort of unpack some potential process principles. The first one is pretty obvious, that because we know technology can and does advance interests, why not develop and apply technology in ways that advance the public interest? However, we have to very quickly follow that up and acknowledge that technology, like law, can constrain and can limit and can take away freedoms and can produce winners and losers. And it doesn't necessarily always do that by design. It can do that sort of accidentally and with systemic effects because of other technologies and other systems that it's embedded in. So therefore, we want to develop and apply technology in ways that do not undermine the public interest. And if we just stopped here, it might seem like a simple story, that resembles some of the bioethics principles we've all seen, such as beneficence, do good, and non-maleficence, don't do bad, right? Do no harm. But I think that would give us a terribly limited sense of all the challenges and complexities that's involved. And so I've just listed a few pitfalls and caveats, as I'm calling them. I think most of us are familiar with these, but I think the world is not. I'm not going to go into all of them, but I'll pick out three. The fallacy of technological determinism, the idea that if we design technology to work in a certain way, it will work in that way, and that when we have outcomes and impacts from technology, that's due to the technology impacting society, as opposed to society reconfiguring itself and reorganizing itself, and often reshaping the technology. The fallacy of technological neutrality says, well, technology is really just a tool and we want to use it for good. So we're going to think about the target, the goal, and just try to hit the target. And if it doesn't work out, maybe we have to change the regulatory system or when in fact, technology, the very design and development and deployment and use of technology is infused with values, assumptions, commitments, and these are sometimes latent, sometimes explicit, sometimes intentional, sometimes unintentional. And this really gets at the heart of the challenge for the PIT practitioner, and that is how to deal with the fact that as soon as you put two bits together, a nut and a bolt together, and you're envisioning this for a societal context, potentially it's going to have normative valence. And then, maybe one more idea of conflicts of interest, and that is, if we develop a technology for the public interest, but we're really focused on promoting that technology, there's nothing wrong with that. It just means that our priorities might actually be different from how we think of them. Right? And so if I am fundamentally advancing a certain technology that happens to, I believe, work in the public interest, it behooves me to say, number one, I'm advancing this technology. Number two, I hope it works in the public interest, as opposed to, for instance, filling up NGOs with a certain type of hardware or software that's actually not going to serve them as well as something else. This is a very serious, I think, caveat to take into mind, because most people who work in the tech industry don't have the luxury of pivoting and saying, oh, I'll just use a different technology, or I'll shift from high tech to appropriate tech. So I think we want to build a space for people whose number one goal might be wealth creation or career advancement or technological promotion, but who seriously want to serve the public, and so that they can be clear to themselves and to others and be more effective. So given these various pitfalls and caveats, I think it's also important to realize that we have to see the technology development process, which we can include use and dissemination and regulation, as well as the public interest articulation process, as two processes that have their own integrity. They're both dynamic, and they are both subject to complexities, and that somehow the goal is to align them. So we really want to make sure that the process, the dynamic process of technology aligns, I've misspelled align, aligns with the complex and underdetermined notion of the public interest. So this notion of alignment sort of is really what I think might help PIT distinguish itself from more simplistic notions of what's going on here. So let me present one vision of how this alignment would work. If we, again, see technology development as a dynamic process and public interest articulation as itself a process that may or may not extend and last as long as the development of a particular technology, but it certainly is something that happens in time in an iterative manner and involves all sorts of complexities. So over time, if we can imagine these things braiding together, and what I like to think of as the public interest technology braid, so that the two processes can really be aligned with one another, so that we can get the desired outcomes, whatever they may be. I've just listed a few here, but we can focus on sustainability, we can focus on accessibility. The point is, it's a very broad set of desiderata that PIT aims to produce, okay? But of course, we have challenges to articulating the public interest. One is that we live in a world in the US that organizes and distributes power through pluralism. And the technology development and use process just cannot accommodate a truly pluralistic environment. This also leads to another challenge, which is legitimacy. And that gets to the notion of how publics perceive technology, those who develop it, and the processes and the organizations and the institutions behind it. And finally, a major challenge to public interest articulation has to do with trade-offs, since there are numerous values and objectives and goals that can go into the public interest, and oftentimes they're not in harmonious relationship with one another. So this brings up different philosophies and schools of thought, some of which say you always have to trade off, some of which say you can satisfice and integrate. I'm not going to get into that, but just simply to point to the challenge. And of course, we have tremendous challenges with technology development and dissemination and use. Technology develops in a complex environment. There are other interacting suites of technology that it will, be interdependent with. And there are base technologies that any technology is built upon. There are economic environments in which technologies are disseminated. There's, uncertainty is absolutely, a problem that essentially gets worse because of the complexity and because of the nature of how decisions during the development cycle and during the use cycle tend to ramify and build upon one another. And because of the, the deep, complex and uncertain notion of society itself and the context of use, we really can't predict positive or negative effects with any certainty. And then technology is what I like to call multivalent as opposed to ambivalent. It has multiple valences, multiple normative valences. The same technology can mean different things to different people. Technology is often described as a double-edged sword. And individuals and groups throughout society tend to sort of have a love-hate relationship with technology. On the one hand, depending upon it and getting very excited about its promises, and the other hand, feeling alienated and distanced from those who develop it and the principles that determine its use. So, this means that we're constantly in the technology development process creating the conditions for unintended consequences. And in the process of creating these conditions, we may not even be aware that we're doing that. And some of these unintended consequences are undesirable, and some of them are even what are called revenge effects. So if we're actually trying to advance the public interest and we end up harming it or undermining it. And I think we just have to be honest with ourselves that these are the conditions under which PIT advances. And so we need to make sure that it's sophisticated and theoretically grounded in its response. So let's see. What I suggest is that more important than, or equally important, but I'm going to say more important than the evaluative criteria that we might want to use to assess whether a particular PIT product or service or system was successful or not. That's certainly very important. And so separate from evaluative criteria or process criteria, these are also separate from planning criteria. The goals that we're trying to hit. All three types of these criteria are important, but I think the devil's in the details, and to actually have a dynamic understanding of what happens between authorizing a PIT project and assessing how successful it was, that's really the stuff of what's interesting. So some meta process criteria that we might want to consider, and I'd be interested in knowing what others would add to this, are, it should be integrative. It should understand that we're dealing with different processes and they don't necessarily speak the same language. There should be an ongoing attentiveness to their integration, and the process by which we integrate them should be robust. It shouldn't just simply be a flow chart that comes out of one tool or somebody's idea of how to integrate, right? It should be something that's reliable and proven. Okay, and so we can be a little more specific and say, what are these process criteria? Well, I think clearly when we are articulating the public interest, we want to do so with an awareness that there are multiple views involved, multiple interests, multiple goals and values. So I think we want to have an inclusive process. And technology development really needs to start in the beginning and throughout its process by being anticipatory. So thinking about what could go wrong and either being prepared to respond to that at the time or responding to it as soon as these are identified, these unintended consequences. Reflexivity is an interesting concept. It basically has to do with recognizing your own values and those of others, and how your own values might be a bias in how you see other people's values. So being aware and accountable about your own values when you articulate what you think is good for the public. Technology development actors need to be vigilant. They need to be constantly attentive to the potential for their choices and decisions and actions and designs to impact the public interest. Public interest articulation needs to be context sensitive. there might be two different groups, but they live in different environments and they might be using the same technology. But because of that, the public interest might require different design or different articulation. I think technology development needs to be flexible to accommodate new ideas and insights and challenges, and possibly to pivot or to reinvent itself or to adapt as it's moving forward. And I think finally, although technology itself, especially in the private sphere, doesn't have the luxury, we could say, in a capitalistic environment to be transparent all the time, right? This has to do with competition and intellectual property laws. The articulation of the public interest can be transparent, and I think it should be. And then finally, as I already mentioned, maybe the key to this entire thing is the adaptability of the technology development process and the people who are involved in it, so that there truly can be an iterative and integrative process. So that's what I've got. I'm happy to take questions and learn from everybody here in terms of how they see the PIT principles.